I took my fiancée to the most expensive new restaurant in town. While we were eating, a man came over and introduced himself as the owner. My fiancée's eyes lit up. It was her ex. After a trip to the ladies' room, she came back and said, "Sorry, I'm getting back with him." The next day, she called me in tears and asked me to pick her up from. I chose the restaurant weeks in advance because I knew exactly what it represented. It was the newest place in the city that everyone talked about, but almost nobody could get into without connections. Reservations were limited, the pricing was aggressive, and the reputation was built around exclusivity rather than comfort. I wanted that night to feel like a turning point. We had been engaged for 8 months, and everything in our life together had settled into a predictable rhythm. This dinner was supposed to be a marker that we were stepping into something bigger, something finished, something public. Her name is Elise Whitmore, and at the time she was still my fiancée. She loved status even when she pretended not to. She liked saying she did not care about appearances, yet she paid attention to them constantly. I booked the table, arranged transportation, and made sure everything ran on schedule. When we arrived, the host recognized my name immediately. That alone told me how carefully the place curated its guests. The dining room was full but quiet in the particular way expensive spaces are. Conversation stayed low, laughter was controlled, and nobody wanted to be noticed for the wrong reason. Elise noticed everything. She adjusted her posture, straightened her dress, and scanned the room before sitting down. I saw excitement on her face, which I took as a good sign. She complimented the interior, the lighting, the way the tables were spaced. It felt like validation for the effort I had put in. Dinner started normally. The server explained the menu, recommended pairings, and spoke with the rehearsed confidence of someone trained to never sound unsure. Elise listened closely. Too closely. She asked questions, smiled longer than usual, and seemed unusually alert. I attributed it to the novelty of the place and nothing more. About 15 minutes into the meal, before the appetizers arrived, a man approached our table. He was not dressed like staff. His suit was tailored, understated, and expensive in a way that did not try to impress. He carried himself with ownership rather than authority. He greeted us politely and introduced himself as the owner of the restaurant. I stood slightly in my chair out of courtesy and shook his hand. He thanked us for coming and made a brief comment about how he appreciated guests who understood what the restaurant was trying to be. I expected the interaction to end there. It did not. The moment Elise looked up at him, something changed. Her expression shifted in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes widened first, then her shoulders stiffened, then she leaned forward slightly as if she had forgotten where she was. The reaction was immediate and unfiltered. It was not polite surprise. It was recognition. The man noticed it too. He paused, just long enough to confirm what he was seeing, and then his tone softened. He addressed her directly, using her first name without asking for it. That detail alone unsettled me. People in that setting did not cross familiarity lines without reason. Elise responded with visible excitement. Her voice rose slightly. She smiled in a way that had nothing to do with manners or courtesy. Only then did it click. This was not a random owner greeting guests. This was a personal encounter. I stayed quiet while they exchanged a few surface-level comments. I watched how she angled her body toward him, how she stopped acknowledging me entirely, how her attention locked onto his presence. I did not interrupt because I wanted to understand exactly what I was seeing before reacting to it. He finally acknowledged me again and clarified who he was. His name was Gideon Cross. He mentioned, casually, that he and Elise knew each other from years ago. The phrasing was deliberate. It minimized the past while confirming its significance. Elise did not correct him. She did not add context. She did not look at me. That silence was the first fracture. Gideon excused himself after a few moments, saying he hoped we enjoyed the evening and that he would check back later. As he walked away, Elise kept watching him. She did not hide it. She did not try to soften it. Her attention followed him until he disappeared into the back of the restaurant. When she finally looked at me again, she seemed distracted, as if she had returned from somewhere else entirely. I asked her if she was okay. She nodded quickly and said she just needed a moment. She stood up and headed toward the ladies' room without waiting for a response. The server arrived with the first course while she was gone. I sat there alone, replaying the interaction in my head, analyzing details I had dismissed too quickly. The familiarity was not accidental. The timing was not accidental. The reaction was not accidental. When Elise returned, she was different. Her energy had shifted completely. She was calm in a way that felt artificial, like someone who had already made a decision and was now moving through the steps required to execute it. She sat down, folded her hands briefly, and looked at me with a detached expression I had never seen directed at me before. She told me she needed to be honest. She explained that seeing Gideon had brought back feelings she had never fully resolved. She said the engagement suddenly felt wrong to her. She said she needed to stop pretending and do what felt right, even if it was uncomfortable. She then told me she was getting back together with him. There was no apology attached to it. There was no acknowledgement of timing or setting. She spoke as if she were informing me of a scheduling change rather than ending a life commitment. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice. I watched her carefully, trying to understand whether this was impulsive or rehearsed. The answer became obvious when she stood up again. She told me she would not be staying for the rest of the meal. She said she had already spoken to Gideon and that they would be leaving separately to avoid unnecessary attention. She picked up her purse, adjusted her coat, and looked around the dining room once more, as if checking whether anyone was watching. They were. I stayed seated while she walked away. I felt the weight of the room shift around me. Conversations softened further. Servers avoided eye contact. The illusion of privacy vanished instantly. I was no longer just a guest. I was a scene. The server returned to ask if I wanted to continue the meal. I told him I would be finishing dinner alone. I did not explain why. He nodded, already understanding more than I wanted him to. I paid the bill in full. I left the restaurant by myself. Outside, the city felt louder than it had an hour earlier. Traffic, voices, movement. Everything continued as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment before getting into the car, realizing that the night had not gone wrong by accident. It had gone wrong because I had been the last person to know something that had already been decided. I did not follow Elise. I went home. I did not sleep that night, but not because I was pacing or replaying scenes in my head. I stayed awake because my phone kept lighting up across the room, vibrating against the wood of the nightstand, then going silent again. I did not answer it. I knew who it was without checking. Elise had a habit of calling until someone picked up, then switching to messages when she felt ignored. By dawn, the phone had stopped moving. That silence felt heavier than the noise. I finally looked at the screen just after sunrise. There were missed calls, then long messages, then shorter ones that lost structure and coherence. The tone changed several times. Confusion shifted into apology. Apology turned into justification. Justification collapsed into panic. The last message simply asked for help. She called again while I was standing in the kitchen. I answered that time because I wanted to hear how she sounded after a night with the man she chose so decisively over me. Her voice was unsteady. She was crying, but not in a controlled way. There was strain in her breathing that suggested she had already been crying for hours. She said she needed me to pick her up. She did not say where she was at first. She said things had not gone the way she expected. She said she had made a mistake and needed me to come get her immediately. I asked where she was. There was a pause long enough to confirm she did not want to answer that question honestly. Eventually, she told me the name of a motel near the highway, one I recognized immediately because it was known for short stays and cash payments. The name did not match anything connected to Gideon Cross. It did not fit the image she had chased the night before. I did not respond emotionally. I told her I would come. The drive took 40 minutes. During that time, I noticed how calm I felt. The anger I expected never arrived. What I felt instead was distance, as if I were driving toward the aftermath of a storm that had already passed. I did not rush. I did not speed. I let traffic dictate the pace. The motel looked exactly like it always had. Peeling paint, flickering sign, parking lot marked by oil stains and neglect. I parked near the entrance and waited for her to come out rather than going inside. When she finally appeared, I barely recognized her. Her clothes were wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back without care. She carried a small bag that looked hastily packed, the kind people use when they leave without planning to stay. She slid into the passenger seat without speaking. I started the car and pulled back onto the road. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. I watched her reflection in the windshield. She kept her head down, staring at her hands. She eventually began explaining without being prompted. She said the night at the restaurant had felt overwhelming, that seeing Gideon again had stirred things she thought were buried. She said he invited her to talk privately after dinner and that she agreed because she wanted closure. She claimed she believed he was different now, that owning the restaurant meant he had changed. The story unraveled as she spoke. She admitted that Gideon had not invited her back to anything resembling a permanent home. She said he had booked the motel because it was close and convenient. She said the conversation turned cold once they were alone. She realized he was more interested in the symbolism of taking her from me than in her as a person. When the excitement wore off, his attention shifted elsewhere. He left early, telling her he had meetings and responsibilities that could not wait. She stayed behind because she had nowhere else to go. I did not comment. I did not correct her narrative or ask questions that would corner her into admitting more. I let her speak because I wanted her to hear herself say it. There was no satisfaction in interrupting. The reality of what had happened was doing enough damage on its own. When we reached my place, she hesitated before getting out of the car. She asked if she could stay for a while. She did not frame it as reconciliation. She framed it as necessity. She said she needed time to think and recover. I agreed, but not for the reason she assumed. I wanted her under my roof long enough to fully understand what she had thrown away. Inside the apartment, she moved cautiously, as if the space might reject her. She looked around and noticed things she had not paid attention to before. The stability, the routine, the quiet order. She commented on how clean everything looked, as if that detail mattered now. She tried to sleep for most of the day. I let her. While she rested, I began receiving messages from people who had been at the restaurant the night before. Not condolences. Questions. Rumors traveled quickly in small circles, especially when status and embarrassment intersected. Someone mentioned that Gideon Cross had a reputation for dramatic gestures followed by abrupt withdrawals. Someone else hinted that his restaurant was not doing as well as it appeared. That was the first time I considered that the night had not only been about Elise's past, but about Gideon's need to assert relevance. When Elise woke up later that afternoon, she tried to reframe what had happened. She suggested that maybe the engagement ending was for the best, that perhaps we had both been forcing something comfortable rather than meaningful. She spoke in abstract terms, avoiding responsibility while attempting to regain moral footing. I listened without responding. Silence unsettled her more than anger would have. That evening, she received a message that changed her posture instantly. I did not see the screen, but I saw her shoulders tighten and her breathing slow. She told me Gideon wanted to talk again. Not to apologize, to clarify boundaries. He made it clear that what happened was not the start of anything ongoing. He framed the encounter as unresolved history that needed release rather than commitment. She read the message twice. That was the moment something broke in her. Not emotionally, but structurally. The version of reality she had built collapsed completely. She had expected a clean transition from one life to another. Instead, she found herself suspended between a past that rejected her and a future she had already abandoned. She cried again, but differently this time. There was no performance in it. No attempt to influence. It was raw realization. I did not comfort her. Later that night, she asked what I planned to do next. I told her I would be moving forward. I did not specify how or when. I simply said that I would not be reversing time or pretending nothing had happened. She nodded, as if she understood, but her expression suggested she still believed she might regain control through patience. She was wrong. The next morning, I told her she needed to start making arrangements to leave. I gave her time, but not reassurance. She packed quietly, avoiding eye contact. Before she left, she asked if there was any chance we could talk later, once everything settled. I told her settlement implied closure, not reconsideration. She left with the same bag she arrived with. As the door closed behind her, I felt something unexpected. Not relief, not anger, but clarity. The events of the last 24 hours had stripped away every illusion that mattered. What remained was choice, and for the first time since the engagement, that choice belonged entirely to me. Once Elise left the apartment for the second time, the situation stopped being private. What had happened at the restaurant had already entered circulation, but now the story began spreading with momentum. People did not contact me out of sympathy. They contacted me because curiosity always travels faster than concern. The combination of an expensive restaurant, a public breakup, and a recognizable owner created a narrative that others felt entitled to analyze. Within a day, I heard from someone who worked in hospitality. He mentioned Gideon Cross without being prompted. He said Gideon's restaurant had launched with aggressive backing and very little margin for error. Investors had expected quick returns, not slow cultivation. The place looked full most nights, but appearance and profitability were not the same thing. Rent alone was bleeding the operation dry. That information reframed the night completely. I began to understand that the encounter was not just personal. It was strategic. Gideon did not merely run into Elise by coincidence. He wanted visibility. He wanted control over a moment that could reinforce his image as someone who took what he wanted, when he wanted it. Elise had mistaken that performance for desire. The next piece came from someone closer to home. A co-worker of Elise's reached out and asked if we were still together. When I said no, she hesitated, then admitted she was not surprised. She explained that Elise had been distracted for weeks. She had been dressing differently, staying late without explanation, and disappearing during lunch breaks. The name Gideon Cross had come up once, framed as an old friend who had made it big. Nobody questioned it at the time. That confirmed the timeline I had avoided confronting directly. Elise had not acted impulsively at the restaurant. She had been preparing for that night long before it happened. The dinner had not been a disruption. It had been a convergence. I did not contact her to confront her about this. The truth no longer needed my involvement to exist. It was unfolding on its own. Over the next few days, more details surfaced organically. Gideon's restaurant began canceling reservations with little notice. A friend of mine who tried to book a table was told the kitchen was closed for maintenance. Another mentioned staff turnover that was unusually rapid for a place that claimed stability. Rumors circulated quietly, but consistently. Gideon's confidence began to look performative rather than earned. Meanwhile, Elise attempted to regain footing through proximity. She reached out to mutual friends, positioning herself as someone who had been overwhelmed and misled. The narrative she offered changed depending on the audience. To some, she was confused. To others, she was brave for choosing honesty. To a few, she hinted that I had been distant, though she never stated it outright. That inconsistency worked against her. People compared notes. Stories overlapped imperfectly. Discrepancies became obvious. Eventually, the sympathy she expected turned into polite distance. Invitations stopped. Messages went unanswered. She had underestimated how much credibility she lost by how publicly she exited the engagement. She reached out to me again late one evening. The message was longer than the others. It acknowledged mistakes without naming them directly. It expressed regret without accountability. It asked whether I thought people ever deserved a second chance after choosing wrong. I did not respond. Silence had become the most honest answer I could give. A week after the restaurant incident, I ran into Gideon Cross in an entirely different setting. Not by design. Not by intention. It happened at a private networking event I attended through work. I recognized him immediately, though his presence there surprised me. He looked less composed than he had at the restaurant. The suit was still expensive, but the confidence was thinner. He noticed me at the same time. He approached with familiarity that felt forced. He commented on the coincidence, suggested that the world was smaller than people realized. He mentioned Elise briefly, framing their history as something that had resurfaced unexpectedly. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge my position in the situation. Instead, he tried to reassert dominance by minimizing it. I listened without engaging. I did not challenge his version of events. I let him talk long enough to reveal his insecurity. He mentioned the restaurant unprompted, speaking about it as if defending it against accusations nobody had made aloud. He referenced investors, future plans, expansions that were not visible anywhere else. When he finally stopped talking, I told him I hoped everything worked out for him. That ended the interaction. 2 days later, Elise sent another message. This one was different. It was shorter and more direct. She told me Gideon had stopped responding entirely. Not gradually. Completely. She said he had blocked her on everything after a brief exchange where she asked for clarity. She wanted to know if I thought that meant he had been lying to her from the beginning. The question answered itself. By the end of the second week, Gideon's restaurant closed temporarily. Officially, it was for restructuring. Unofficially, staff had not been paid on time, suppliers were withholding deliveries, and at least one investor was threatening legal action. None of this made headlines. It circulated quietly among people who paid attention to such things. Elise heard about it through a friend and spiraled. The illusion she had chased collapsed fully. There was no prize waiting at the end of her decision. There was only fallout. She showed up at my door without warning. I did not invite her in immediately. I stood in the doorway and let the silence do the work. She looked exhausted, thinner than before, worn down by stress rather than remorse. She said she needed to talk, that she finally understood what she had done. I let her speak, but I did not step aside. She admitted she had believed Gideon represented upward movement. She admitted she thought the restaurant symbolized permanence and success. She admitted she assumed I would remain available if things did not work out the way she expected. That last part was not framed as cruelty. It was framed as assumption, which made it worse. I told her that assumption was why the door would not open. She asked if there was anything she could do to fix what she broke. I told her fixing something required respecting it before it was damaged. She nodded, but understanding arrived too late to matter. When she left, she did not ask to come back again. The next morning, I learned that Gideon Cross's restaurant had shut down indefinitely. The signage was gone. The reservation system was offline. The performance had ended. What remained was consequence. By the time Gideon Cross's restaurant shut down completely, the story had already lost its novelty to the public. That was how these things always worked. People were fascinated during the collapse, then bored once the outcome became inevitable. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic closure. One week the place was temporarily closed, and the next the sign was gone and the windows were covered from the inside. I drove past it once out of curiosity. The location looked smaller without the illusion of success attached to it. What had once felt untouchable now looked like just another failed experiment that overestimated image and underestimated endurance. Elise found out the same way everyone else did. Not through Gideon. Not through an explanation. Through absence. His silence never lifted. The restaurant never reopened. The future she believed she had stepped into evaporated without acknowledging her presence in it. She reached out again, but this time there was no attempt at emotional framing. The message was practical. She asked if I still had access to some of the shared documents from our engagement period. She needed them for housing applications and employment verification. The fact that she asked instead of assuming access was telling. Her certainty had eroded completely. I sent her what she needed without commentary. Helping her stabilize was not the same as reopening the door she closed herself. I understood the difference clearly. Over the next few weeks, her life contracted rapidly. Mutual friends stopped inviting her to group events. Some out of loyalty to me, others because they no longer trusted her motivations. People noticed patterns once the spotlight shifted away. She had aligned herself with success when it looked solid and retreated when it did not. That behavior left a residue. She tried to rebuild her image through work. That failed quietly. Her workplace had already heard the story, and while nobody disciplined her officially, she was passed over for opportunities she would have received months earlier. Reliability mattered in environments that relied on discretion. She had demonstrated neither. I did not celebrate this. I observed it. The difference mattered. Gideon Cross resurfaced briefly in a different context. An acquaintance mentioned seeing his name connected to a civil dispute involving unpaid obligations. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just the slow administrative consequences of running out of leverage. He was no longer spoken about as an owner or innovator. He was referred to as someone who had overreached. Elise heard about that too. That knowledge hit her harder than his silence ever did. It forced her to confront the reality that the choice she made was not between two men, but between stability and spectacle. She had chosen spectacle. Spectacle does not stay. She asked to meet one final time. I agreed, not because I owed her closure, but because I wanted to end the situation without ambiguity. We met in a neutral space during the afternoon. No intimacy, no nostalgia, just conversation stripped of expectation. She looked different again, not in appearance, but in posture. The confidence she once carried had been replaced with carefulness. She spoke slowly, as if choosing each word to avoid further damage. She admitted that she had assumed success functioned like inheritance, something you stepped into and absorbed. She admitted she believed proximity to power would create permanence. She admitted she underestimated the cost of burning stable ground. I listened without interruption. She asked whether I ever considered taking her back after the motel night. The question was quiet, almost academic. I answered honestly. I told her that I considered it briefly, not out of longing, but out of habit. Habit dissolved quickly once I realized the decision she made required pre-existing preparation. She accepted that answer without argument. She asked what I planned to do next. I told her I was moving forward deliberately. I did not frame it as victory or growth. I framed it as direction. I had learned what I needed to learn, and that learning had changed the way I evaluated people. She nodded. That was the last time we met. After that, contact faded naturally, not through conflict or avoidance, through irrelevance. We no longer occupied the same trajectory, and neither of us pretended otherwise. Months passed. My life stabilized in ways that did not announce themselves loudly. Work progressed. Relationships remained distant by choice rather than fear. I did not rush into anything new. I allowed time to reset my instincts. Trust, I learned, was not about optimism. It was about consistency over pressure. Elise relocated eventually. A smaller place. A different social circle. Her presence disappeared from the spaces we once shared. I heard updates indirectly. She was working again. She was managing. Nothing exceptional. Nothing catastrophic. Just life narrowed by previous decisions. That was consequence in its purest form. Gideon Cross faded even more thoroughly. His name stopped circulating altogether. Whatever ambitions he still held were private and unremarked. Without attention, his influence collapsed completely. The man who had once walked through his restaurant with ownership in his posture now existed only as a cautionary reference. The night at the restaurant never repeated itself in my life, but its effect remained. It taught me that betrayal often arrives dressed as opportunity. It taught me that power performed for attention rarely survives scrutiny. It taught me that walking away without spectacle creates outcomes louder than confrontation ever could. I did not win because I outplayed anyone. I won because I stayed where reality held.